The morning they brought her the treaty documents, Empress Veilsora of the Ninth Dominion was eating a bowl of amber fruit pulp and watching two of her warships burn in the simulation projector above her throne. The fires weren't real. The projector was showing her last week's intelligence, what the human fleet had done to outpost Kalen in approximately 4 minutes and 31 seconds. She watched it 3 times before she set down her spoon. "They want a marriage," said her first advisor, Kren, whose 4 eyes were all aimed slightly away from her, the way they did when he was frightened. A human diplomat arrived at the border station at 6th Rise. He carried paper, actual paper. Veilsora let the simulation play again. Paper. They said it was a gesture of good faith. That their kind uses it for things that matter. Kren's throat sac pulsed visibly against the collar of his station robes. Their proposed terms are unusual. They're not asking for territory, not resources, not prisoner exchange. They want the Empress to take a husband from their species, one man, to be seated at her side during all treaty negotiations. They say it would signal to both populations that the ceasefire is genuine. She watched the 4th replay. In the simulation, the human ship didn't look like much, smaller than her frigates, older silhouette, running lights that flickered in a way that suggested either neglect or deliberate misdirection. It had arrived alone at Outpost Kalen, which housed 400 soldiers and a particle cannon rated for deep space engagements. The human ship had lasted through 2 salvos before something changed aboard it. Then the cannon was gone. Then the garrison was gone. The ship drifted for 11 minutes as if considering its next appointment. Then it left. "One man," she said. "Their letter says, send us 1 man in kind. He will come unarmed, and you will find that unarmed is his least dangerous state." She looked at Kren for a long moment. He was one of her longest-serving advisors, 4 decades in the imperial court, survivor of 2 succession crises, and a civil border dispute that had cost the Dominion 3 systems. He had the kind of institutional courage that came from knowing exactly how bad things could get. He was frightened now. "Except," she said. The human they sent was named Elias Voss. He arrived at the Imperial docking bay in a shuttle that looked held together with deliberate stubbornness. Every weld visible, every patch an act of determination rather than elegance. The whole vehicle giving off the particular impression of something that had been told it was going to stop working and had declined the information. He stepped out carrying a single bag and a thermos of something that smelled, according to her chief sentreater, like roasted seeds steeped in bitter water, heated to a temperature her people would have associated with sterilization. He was not what she expected, though she had learned by then, reviewing the intelligence files on every significant human military engagement of the past 6 years, that nothing about humans was what you expected. They had a biology that was redundant in ways that made her xenobiologists uncertain whether to classify it as resilient or simply reckless. They had a psychological profile that confounded every predictive model the Dominion had developed. They learned under fire. They adapted between engagements. They got better at being in danger the more danger they encountered, which was not a characteristic her military strategists had planned for. He was of medium height, gray at the temples, which apparently indicated age among their kind, though her xenobiologists couldn't agree on which direction aging moved for humans. Their bodies seemed to wear their years outward, like accumulated armor, rather than hiding them as a mark of infirmity, the way the Dominion's aristocratic classes did. He had a face that had been broken in several places and healed at angles that weren't quite straight. Her aesthetic advisors, when she had later asked their assessment, said, "Distinguished, like a geographical feature." They were not wrong. His face had the quality of terrain. His eyes were a color her language had no word for, somewhere between the deep gray of weapons-grade alloys and the blue of a burning fuel cell. They moved constantly, cataloging, measuring, and they did not do what she was accustomed to eyes doing in her presence, which was to find her and then stop elsewhere because looking directly at the Empress for too long was a form of aggression. Voss looked at her steadily and without theater. He looked at the honor guard she'd assembled, 40 soldiers in formal resonance armor, their carapaces polished to a mirror finish, their discharge spines erect in the position of ceremony, and he nodded once, like a man acknowledging a well-set table before sitting down to eat. He was not intimidated. He was not performing not being intimidated, which would have been obvious. He simply wasn't. "Empress," he said. He didn't bow. She found later, reading the xenographic reports in the Imperial Archives, that humans reserved bowing for contexts of either deep genuine reverence or calculated political theater. He had apparently decided that neither applied. Ambassador Voss. She had practiced the pronunciation of his name for 3 days. Human phonemes were made in the soft front of the mouth in ways that felt reckless to her kind, like speaking without structural support. "You are the man your people sent to make peace." "I'm the man they sent," he agreed. "Whether it becomes peace is up to you." She married him 6 days later in a ceremony that her court described afterward variously as haunting, structurally confusing, and in one case, like watching a catastrophe occur in reverse. He stood beside her in clothes that fit him like they'd been chosen by someone who had read a description of formal human attire but never seen it, which in fact they had been, because her tailors had worked from written specifications only. He didn't appear to notice, or to mind. He drank whatever was placed in front of him, inquired about the ingredients of 2 things with what seemed like genuine culinary interest, and declined the third politely, by saying that he had a condition that made it inadvisable. He spoke when spoken to. He listened, she noticed, with his entire body, not just his auditory organs but his eyes, his posture, the slight tilt of his head that her xenobiologist said indicated active information processing. He was recording everything. Not for surveillance, she thought. It was different from surveillance. He was building a model of the room, the people in it, the relationships between them. She had been watching diplomats do this for 20 years. She had never seen it done so completely or so quietly. What she did not expect was that he would be funny. Not in performance. Not in the way her court jesters manufactured humor as a professional service, with timing and escalation and the mechanical deployment of surprise. He said something quiet at one point to the chief diplomat of the Eastern Fleet, who had been visibly struggling with the ceremonial fermentation drink for the better part of an hour, not wanting to offend by not drinking it, not able to drink it without consequences his expression was announcing in advance. She didn't hear what Voss said, but the chief diplomat made a sound she had never heard a member of his species produce, a convulsive exhalation from the upper respiratory tract, repeated 3 times, the second time louder than the first. His secondary eyes were watering. He spent the rest of the ceremony standing slightly closer to Voss than protocol required, and twice more made the sound, more quietly, apparently in response to nothing she could identify. The chief diplomat filed a note with her office 2 days later. It said only, "The ambassador is a useful person. Please keep him." The assassination attempt came on the 9th day. She had expected it. The factions within her own dominion who opposed the treaty, who believed that the human military's victories at Outpost Kalen and Meridian Shelf and the Drun Passage were flukes, or the product of unusual circumstances, or achievable only against unprepared opponents, or some combination of all 3, had been making their opposition known since the announcement. In the Dominion's political architecture, making opposition known had a range of expressions, some of them procedural and some of them not. What she had not factored into her calculations was that the assassin would go for Voss rather than for her. It made a kind of cold sense, she realized later, examining it the way she examined military setbacks, not for the purpose of blame but for the purpose of understanding what she had missed. Kill the Empress and you make a martyr of the treaty. Kill the human and you make a failure of it. You demonstrate that the Dominion cannot protect even the peace gesture it has made. you discredit the entire framework. The assassin entered through the water recirculation system in the Eastern Wing. He was good, a professional, contracted through one of the Outer Dominion factions that had the resources and the motive. He moved through the maintenance corridors without triggering a single sensor. He found the humans' quarters by process of elimination. The wing was new construction, assigned only for the duration of the diplomatic stay, and the access points were limited. What he did not account for was that Voss wasn't in his quarters. Voss was in the corridor outside his quarters, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall and his thermos in his hands, because he could not sleep and did not know what to do with himself in an unfamiliar room at 3 in the morning. He had been sitting there for approximately 40 minutes according to the corridor sensor's passive monitoring, which her security team reviewed afterward with the specific emotion of people who have realized, in retrospect, that a catastrophe was also a miracle. He was still awake when the wall panel came loose. The thing that happened next was reconstructed from the corridor sensors and from Voss's own account, given the following morning to her security chief, with the unhurried flatness of a man reporting a blocked drainage conduit. The assassin came through the wall panel, expecting to enter a room with a sleeping target. He found instead a man sitting on the corridor floor who looked up at him with gray-blue eyes and said, in a tone of genuine curiosity, "Are you lost?" The assassin, apparently thrown, hesitated for approximately 1.5 seconds. He didn't appear alarmed, her security chief told her later. She could tell from the way he held his secondary arms, tucked close in the posture her species used when processing something their brain was classifying as structurally impossible, that he was still working through it. The assassin was armed with 2 plasma blades and a neural disruptor. Ambassador Voss was armed with a thermos of pressurized hot liquid made from roasted ground seeds. And the ambassador used the thermos as a striking implement. He removed one of the plasma blades in the process. He then used the plasma blade as a lever too. Her security chief stopped. He appeared to be searching for technical vocabulary adequate to the event. He did several things in a specific sequence, Empress. Our sensors captured all of it. The analysts are still debating the mechanics. The consensus is that the sequence required a precise knowledge of his opponent's anatomy that the ambassador should not have had access to. But he did. He appears to have read the xenographic medical files available in the public Dominion archives. He read them. Then he used them. And the assassin. Alive, not comfortable, available for questioning within the hour. Her security chief paused. He appears to have been told in advance that the human diplomat would be an easy target. I want to note, for the record, that whoever told him that was either very wrong or deliberately misleading the man. She went to see Voss herself. He was in the corridor still. The cleanup team hadn't arrived yet, and he'd remained because, he explained, it seemed impolite to leave a scene you were involved in before the relevant authorities arrived. He looked the same as he always did, which was the main thing that unsettled her, the same settled quality, the same level attention. He held up his left hand briefly, almost as an aside. The 3rd and 4th fingers were at the wrong angle. I'll set these later. I've done it before. It's not a problem. You're not, she stopped. In her language, the phrase would have been something like disrupted in your core feeling, the involuntary destabilization that followed exposure to violence. Every species she knew experienced some version of it. It was biological, not moral. The body's response to having been made suddenly aware of its own fragility. You're not shaken. He considered this carefully, which she already knew was his way with all questions. He didn't give fast answers that required walking back. He gave slow ones that were accurate. I grew up in a place called Detroit, he said. It was economically difficult at the time. And then I was in the border wars on the eastern continent before the unification. And then I was in the early contacts with your people's advanced scouts. And then I commanded at Kalen and Meridian and the Drun Passage. He took a sip from the thermos. The liquid inside was still hot. He had apparently been sitting in this corridor, in a foreign imperial station in the middle of the night, drinking something hot and waiting for whatever came next. "I'll be fine. Are you all right?" She realized he was asking because he meant it, not as protocol, not as the reflexive reciprocity of diplomatic exchange. He was asking because it had occurred to him, in this corridor after what had just happened, to wonder how she was doing. "I am," she said. She looked for the right word and found it inadequate when she did. "Recalibrating." He nodded. "That's a good word for it." She sat with him there in the corridor for 11 minutes. She could not afterward fully explain why. There were duties that had been triggered by the security alert, reports to review, advisors to convene, a protocol chain to initiate. She sat in the corridor with her peace ambassador and his crooked fingers and his thermos of hot bitter liquid while the station around them came slowly awake, and something settled in her that she also did not have a precise word for. The treaty talks began formally 3 weeks after the wedding. 6 delegations in a room that smelled of different biologies and different anxieties, around a table that had been built to specifications that no single species found entirely comfortable, which Voss said, when she asked him about it the evening before, was actually the correct architecture for a diplomatic table. "Everyone should be slightly uncomfortable," he'd said. "Comfortable people defend what they already have." She watched him at those meetings. He said little. When he spoke it was quietly and precisely, and the delegates leaned toward him slightly when he did, the way you leaned toward a sound you weren't sure you'd heard correctly, not because his voice was quiet but because it was specific, every word load-bearing, nothing decorative. He never performed intelligence. That was what she kept noticing. Her own advisors performed intelligence constantly. The deployment of expertise as territory, the demonstration of knowledge as a form of dominance, the very shape of their sentences designed to remind the room that they knew things other people didn't. Voss simply knew things and occasionally mentioned them when they were relevant. The difference was difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore once you had seen it. It was the difference between a weapon you were shown and a weapon that was simply present. The Drun Passage incident came up in the second week of negotiations. The hegemony delegation raised it, formally, with documentation, in the tone of people who had been preparing this particular argument for some time. They wanted it on record that the human assault on the Drun Passage had been unprovoked, that the garrison there had been conducting routine operations, that the destruction of 7 vessels and the military infrastructure of the passage represented a war crime under the Galactic Accords and should be addressed before any forward treaty architecture could be considered credible. There was a silence. She watched Voss's face. "The garrison at Drun Passage," he said, without any particular heat, as if raising a fact rather than a counterargument, was using the Accord's definition of routine operations to cover the processing of civilian vessels from 3 non-aligned systems. "The processing I'm describing isn't resource extraction. The crews of those vessels are," he paused briefly. "Were mostly," he looked around the table. "We have the manifests, intake logs, processing facility documentation recovered from the site. We can share all of it. We'd like it in the record too." The quality of the silence changed. "The assault on Drun Passage was mine," Voss said. "I designed it. I commanded it. I take responsibility for every death that happened there, and I am prepared to account for each one in detail if that's what this body wants." He looked around the table once steadily. "If we're putting things on record, I'd like all of them in there. Or we can skip this section and move to Articles 7 through 12. Your choice." The hegemony delegation chose to move to Articles 7 through 12. She asked him that evening, in the private garden off her quarters, where the climate was adjusted to a range that neither of them found precisely comfortable but both found acceptable, how many engagements he'd commanded. The garden had been modified 3 days after his arrival. The ceiling dome, which had been set to a uniform gray, the default for that wing, energy efficient and neutral, had been changed. She'd found him on the 3rd day standing in the corridor outside the garden's entrance, looking through the viewport at the dome ceiling with an expression she hadn't been able to categorize. She'd asked what he was looking at. He'd said, "Nothing, just hoping for something that looked like evening." The dome had been reprogrammed that night to cycle through an approximation of a sunset spectrum. It had not been officially ordered. Her staff had simply done it. 11 direct commands, he said, more as a senior officer with operational input into larger engagements. He was looking at the simulated sunset. His face in the amber light had the quality of terrain after rain, the same geography, different surface. The number doesn't change the weight of it. People seem to think it should. More battles, more distance. It doesn't work that way. And you won them. Not all of them. A pause. Sometimes winning looks like something else when you're close to it. You don't know for years which thing it was. "Kalen," she said, "that was yours." She'd thought about raising it many times. She hadn't been able to decide whether it was the right thing to do or the wrong thing, which usually meant it was both. She raised it now because they were in a garden, and it was becoming evening, and he'd been honest with her in every other register, and she wanted to be honest in return, which meant acknowledging the weight she'd been carrying since she'd first seen that simulation. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that the simulated sky shifted 2 degrees toward indigo. "Kalen was mine," he said finally. "It shouldn't have worked. I designed it around 3 assumptions about your garrison commander's decision-making, based on her service record and the standard protocols for that class of installation. All 3 assumptions were correct. She made the choices I expected her to make because they were the logical choices given what she knew. She didn't know what I knew." He turned the thermos in his hands. It was empty now, but he still held it. "That's not her fault. That's the nature of the thing." "She was one of my best commanders," Veilsora said. "I know." His voice was level, but there was something under it. "I read her record before Kalen. That was part of the design. I needed to know how she thought." He was quiet again. "I think about her, not every day anymore, but often enough." "You design wars around the specific people in them. Around what people are when they're doing their best with what they have. That's the only version that's honest." He looked at the fake stars beginning to emerge in the dome ceiling. When you design around the best version of your opponent and you win anyway, you know you've actually found something real. When you design around a cartoon of them, around what you want them to be, you win and you haven't learned anything. The next time they surprise you. She looked at him in the simulated evening light. "You are a strange man to send as a peace ambassador." He smiled, a small thing, one corner of his mouth. "I'm the one who understood what the fighting was costing, both sides. That made me useful in a different direction." "Did they argue when they chose you?" "Extensively." He stood, rolling the thermos between his palms. "The argument against me was that I knew too much about how to fight to be trusted with stopping it. The argument for me was the same thing. The second attempt on his life was more sophisticated and came with less warning. They used a nerve agent calibrated for human biochemistry. Her intelligence services identified it afterward as a compound requiring considerable technical sophistication, acquired through channels that she would be spending considerable political energy tracing in the months ahead. It was delivered through the ventilation system in the secondary conference room during a recess, timed to coincide with a window when the room would contain only the human delegation. It should have killed him. Her own analysts, reviewing the dispersal rates and concentration levels and the standard human physiological response data in the Dominion's xenographic database, were clear. The dosage was twice what was necessary for a lethal outcome. The delivery window was textbook. The agent was correctly calibrated. It should have incapacitated him within 8 minutes and killed him before medical intervention was possible. What they had not accounted for was a prescription medication Voss had been taking since a deployment, years before, in an environment where a related class of compound had been used as an area denial weapon. His physician, reviewing his records, had maintained the protocol as a precaution. It rendered the nerve agent significantly less effective, not harmless, but insufficient. He was sick for 4 days. Badly sick in ways that alarmed her medical staff, who had been learning human biology for 6 weeks and had reached the plateau where they knew enough to be frightened by what they were seeing, but not enough to be certain their interventions were helping. His temperature ran at levels that in any species they had previously treated would have indicated systemic collapse. His cardiovascular system showed strain patterns that didn't match any of the projected response curves in the literature. He kept waking up and asking about the negotiations. She sat with him on the second day. She didn't plan to. She had duties: the security investigation, the political fallout, 3 delegations requiring individual reassurance, her first advisor Kren presenting every 40 minutes with a new item that required decision. She sat with him because the medical team's reports had a quality she recognized. The quality of people describing something they didn't have the vocabulary for yet, and trying to project confidence while the vocabulary was still being assembled. She had sat through reports like that twice before in her life, in military contexts, and both times they had been immediately preceding a very bad outcome. He was awake when she arrived. He was lying in the medical bay's constructed human-appropriate bed. Her engineers had worked from specifications supplied by the human embassy, and the result was close but not quite right in a way he had clearly noticed and declined to mention. With his eyes open, and his hands folded on his chest in the posture of a man who is conserving energy rather than resting. "You shouldn't be here," he said. His voice was roughened at the edges, but the underlying timbre was the same. "You're not contagious. I mean politically." He looked at her without moving his head. "The investigation's live. You sitting at my bedside, while the secondary conference room is still being processed, sends a message." "What message?" "That you're treating this as something done to you rather than something done to me. That the Dominion's response is personal, not procedural." He shifted carefully. "Which might be accurate, but as a signal it creates complications." She stared at him. He was 2 days into a neurological toxic event, and he was managing her public communications posture. "How are the negotiations?" "On hold." "Don't let them go on hold." He found a slightly better angle in the bed. "They'll use the pause to re-entrench. The hegemony delegation especially. They were close to movement on Article 11 before this. If the momentum stops, that movement stops." He closed his eyes briefly. "Keep it moving. Come sit with me after there's something to sign." "You nearly died." "Nearly" is doing a lot of work in that sentence. He opened his eyes again. "I'm fine, or I'll be fine. How's the Meridian delegation?" "Why would I know how the Meridian delegation is?" "Because you've been speaking with their second chair delegate during the garden hour for the past 8 days. Every evening I've been there, you've moved toward her section of the table afterward, which I initially thought was coincidence, and then didn't. She's been less defensive in formal sessions since you started. Either you're making genuine progress with her, or you're both very fond of simulated sunsets, and she doesn't seem like the type." There was a long pause. "You've been watching me navigate the delegations," she said. "I've been watching everything." He said it without apology or self-congratulation. "That's my job. The negotiations have 12 parties with 17 significant sub-interests, 6 of which aren't declared. I watch everything because the undeclared interests are usually where the treaty either holds or fails." He paused. "The Meridian second chair's name is Delegate Auen Farr. She has a daughter who was in the Drun Passage engagement. The daughter survived. I think you knew that and used it. I think that was the right call." She sat for a while after he fell asleep, which happened mid-sentence. He was describing the potential movement on Article 11, and then he simply wasn't, his body having made the decision his consciousness had been resisting. She sat and looked at the room her engineers had built wrong in ways too small to justify complaining about, and at the medical equipment, monitoring the things happening in his body that her physicians were still finding vocabulary for, and she thought about what it meant to have sent someone to the border of a war and had him show up with a thermos. The treaty was signed on the 47th day. She stood beside him at the table and watched him read the final document, all 43 pages of it, twice, which took 19 minutes, which no one commented on because the room had reached the stage of collective exhaustion, where the observation of small anomalies had been suspended pending the larger objective. He signed with a pen her engineers had provided, another human artifact, ink in a tube with a precision tip, and the signature was the same as the one on the initial proposal documents, illegible, specific, a character rather than a word. After in the garden, he opened a small metal flask, different from the thermos, flatter, older, a dent in its side that was clearly historical rather than accidental. He poured some of its contents into a second cup he had apparently been carrying in his jacket pocket. "A human custom," he said, handing her the cup, "at the end of something difficult." "What is it?" "Whiskey, he seemed to be trying to find an analogy that would translate. "Fermented grain, distilled, very old method, the process takes years. The result is," he appeared to give up on description, "you don't have to." She drank it. It tasted like being spoken to honestly by something that was mostly on fire. "That," she said after the appropriate moment, "is extremely unpleasant." "Yeah," he was smiling, the full version this time, which was rarer than the partial one and changed the geometry of his face considerably. "But you remember it." She did remember it. She thought about that, about the design of the thing, the deliberateness of making peace memorable in that particular way. You don't remember comfort. You remember the thing that was difficult and true. Outside the garden dome, in the vast mechanical quiet of the Imperial Station, the delegations were packing their documentation and arranging their transports home, and the machinery of peace was beginning its slow, effortful rotation, turning against the accumulated resistance of 6 years of war and all the investments, of material and identity and grief, that war required people to make. The question, she thought, was whether the machinery had enough force behind it, whether what they had built in 47 days was a structure or a gesture. "What happens to you now?" she asked. "The treaty is signed, your role has a second phase." He held the flask without drinking from it, turning it slowly. "The outer factions didn't sign. They'll watch, 3 months, maybe 4, then they'll test the architecture." She looked at him. "You knew this was coming." Anyone who was paying attention knew. The treaty creates the framework. The framework has to survive its first real test before it's real. He set the flask down on the bench between them. "I'd like to stay if that's acceptable. The second phase is the harder one." She thought of the word in her language, the placeholder construction, used for truths not yet fully spoken. "It's acceptable," she said, and filed the real version away. 3 months after the signing, the outer factions moved. She had known it was coming. Voss had been saying so for 6 weeks, quietly and precisely, in the way he said things he was certain about. He'd been watching supply movement patterns, communication traffic through the outer relay stations, and some category of behavioral signal she didn't fully understand. Something about the spacing of communiques, the timing of supply requisitions, the particular phrasing used by certain officers in routine dispatches. She had asked him to explain it once and he had tried, and by the 3rd sentence she had understood that she was looking at something that had been built over decades of close observation, a system for reading military intent that could not be transferred in a conversation. The 8th Dominion Fleet, rogue, operating without her authorization, commanded by Admiral Selvaric, who had been her most decorated field officer and her most consistent opponent of the treaty, crossed the border into the human system of Ferriscale with 42 warships. His message to his own crew, intercepted and decoded by her intelligence services within the hour, said, "No piece of paper signed in a comfortable room by people who have forgotten what the war cost will determine the fate of the Ninth Dominion. This fleet will remind both sides what reality looks like." She received the alert at fourth rise. By the time she reached the command center, Voss was already there. She didn't know how he had gotten there first. Later, reviewing the entry logs, her security staff determined that he had arrived 9 minutes before the alert reached her quarters, which meant he had been moving before the alert was formal, which meant something she thought about for a long time afterward. He was standing at the tactical display with his arms folded and his thermos in his left hand, looking at the fleet positions with the specific quality of attention she had learned to read as conclusive. He already knew what this was, and he had already decided what came next. The decision was done. He was just watching the confirmation arrive. 42 ships, she said. Yeah. Selvaric is experienced. 30 years of active command. I know his record. His eyes were on the display. He'll form up in the Dominion's standard deep strike shell pattern, suppression fire leading the advance, the main line behind the shell at staged intervals. He's used it in 7 engagements. It's his signature approach. It works well against static defense positions with limited mobility and conventional countermeasures. She noticed what he had not said, and Ferriscale. He turned and looked at her. His face was what it always was in the moments that mattered most, not calm in the absence of feeling, but settled in a way that came from having been more frightened in more places than most people could imagine, and having found that frightened was not the same as incapable. "Ferriscale will be fine," he said. "You're certain?" "I am." He looked back at the display. The fleet icons were moving in formation, the precise geometry of Selvaric's approach already visible in their spacing. Selvaric is going to find that Ferriscale has an unusual amount of mobility, and some other things. She looked at him for a long moment. What other things? "Things I arranged during the 2nd month of negotiations." Quietly, he turned to face her fully. The command center's tactical lighting made his eyes the color of deep water. "I didn't stop commanding when I became a peace ambassador. I changed what I was commanding toward." She understood then, completely, in the way that you understand something you have been slowly approaching for a long time and have finally reached, what the letter had meant. The line she had read and filed as metaphor. "You will find that unarmed is his least dangerous state." He was not unarmed. He had simply redefined the word. The battle at Ferriscale lasted 11 hours and 14 minutes. She watched most of it from the command center, standing, declining the offered seating, with Voss beside her. He had been asked twice to participate in the tactical analysis, and had declined both times and then been asked again by her own senior strategist with a specificity that amounted to pleading, and had stayed on the condition that he was there as an observer only, which everyone in the room understood was a formal distinction without much practical weight. He was the quietest observer she had ever been in a room with. Selvaric's fleet formed up as predicted. The shell advance began. The suppression line engaged the Ferriscale defense station at the projected intervals in the projected sequence. What they encountered was not what they had prepared for. Her tactical analysts used the word impossible 3 times in the first hour, then retired it as insufficient. The Ferriscale defense station's capabilities exceeded all projected parameters by a margin that suggested not an upgrade but a fundamental redesign. The human vessels in the system moved with a coordination that bore no relationship to standard human fleet doctrine, which the Dominion had studied, war-gamed, and modeled extensively. They moved as if the battle space had been designed for them specifically, as if the geometry of the fight had been built around their particular strengths. In the third hour, something happened to Selvaric's suppression line that her analysts could not account for. 7 vessels lost primary propulsion simultaneously in a pattern that suggested not a weapons hit, but a cascade failure triggered by something the defense had done to the electromagnetic environment of the battle space 40 minutes earlier. Prepositioned. Prepared. In the fourth hour, Selvaric attempted to reorganize and switch to his secondary advance pattern. Her senior strategist, watching the display, said quietly, "They know what's coming." She didn't reply. She was watching Voss. He was looking at the display with the same expression he'd had in the garden the first time she'd asked him about Kalen. The expression of a man who understood exactly what the cost was, and had decided in advance that it was the right thing to pay. The secondary pattern failed, not unexpectedly, in the way that something fails when the force opposing it was specifically configured to address it, not adaptation, anticipation. In the 7th hour, Selvaric attempted to withdraw. 11 ships did not successfully withdraw. The remaining 31 held position and ceased active fire in the 8th hour, when it became clear to Selvaric that withdrawal was now a negotiation rather than a maneuver. In the 11th hour, he transmitted a request for terms. She looked at Voss. He was looking at the display. His arms were still folded. He had not moved significantly in 4 hours. His thermos was empty. "Terms," she said. "Their crews are alive. That was the objective from the beginning, not to destroy the fleet, to demonstrate that destruction was available. There's a difference." He finally moved, unfolding his arms. He looked tired in a way she had not seen before, not the bone-deep exhaustion of the nerve agent, but the specific weight of having done something necessary and not pleasant. "The ships can be returned when Selvaric and the command staff are transferred to Dominion custody. Your custody. Tried under Dominion law by Dominion process. That's important." "Why?" "Because if we hold them, we own the consequence. The outer factions use us as the reason the Dominion can't be trusted. If the Dominion holds them, if this is a Dominion matter, a Dominion correction of a Dominion violation, then it belongs to you. Your legal architecture, your outcome." He looked at her. "It strengthens the treaty. It costs you something politically in the short term and gains you something larger in the long term." She thought about Selvaric. 30 years of service. His daughter had served under her grandmother. He had been right about some things, about the cost of the war, about what the Dominion had spent that it would never recover. He had simply drawn the wrong conclusion from correct premises, which was the most common and most dangerous form of error. What about the people on those ships who were following orders? They served their terms under Dominion military code, standard protocols. He paused. The young ones, the ones who had no say in where the ship was pointed, I'd ask you to consider that in the sentencing. He said it without pressure. A request, not a condition. I know that's your decision. She looked at the display. The battle space was quieting now, the geometry of it settling into the static configuration of a fight that was over. The icons of Selvaric's fleet scattered and stopped, Ferriscale intact behind its defense architecture. "You won this battle," she said. "We held our position. The distinction was apparently important to him. That's different from winning. Winning implies the other side lost something they shouldn't have. This was..." He was quiet for a moment, finding the right construction. This was a demonstration. The outer factions wanted to know if the treaty architecture had anything behind it. Now they know. He turned away from the display. "I'd like to go to the garden if that's acceptable." She walked with him. She didn't plan to. There were matters to address. The secure transmission to her legal counsel, the public statement for the system channels. She told her first advisor Kren to begin both processes and follow the protocols they had prepared in advance, because she had learned from a human peace ambassador the value of preparing for contingencies you hoped would not occur. Then she walked to the garden. The simulated sky was in its transitional phase, deep blue, the space between day and night, neither of them entirely. He sat on the bench near the far wall. He didn't reach for the thermos or the flask. He sat with his hands open on his knees. She sat beside him. She had stopped counting the times she'd chosen to do this, the specific selection of beside rather than across, the abandonment of the spatial protocols that governed imperial interaction. She had stopped explaining it to herself. When this is resolved, she said, meaning the tribunal, the political restructuring, the 6 months of careful navigation she could already see arrayed in front of her. What do you want? He looked at her sideways. He was doing the thing he did with questions he was taking seriously, measuring it from several angles before responding. From the treaty, a pause. From the Dominion, another smaller pause, or in general. In general, she said, and felt the weight of the phrase settle into the air between them like something that had been waiting to be said for a long time. He was quiet. The simulated stars were coming out, her engineers cycling through the familiar progression, first the brightest ones, then the medium, then the fine scattered field of the smaller ones, until the dome was full of the approximation of a sky he must have known from some actual place, some actual night. There's a place on my homeworld, he said finally, northern coast. You can see the water from the cliffs, real water, moving water, the kind that has weight and force to it. In the evening the light comes in at an angle that, he stopped. His hands were still on his knees, open. I used to think I'd go back there eventually. Before the war I held that as a kind of destination. After the war started I stopped thinking about it. He turned his head and looked at her directly. I think I might be starting to think about it again. She looked at the artificial evening around them. The sky her people had built because a man had stood in a corridor hoping for something that looked like the end of a day. I have never seen an ocean, she said. No. My world has large bodies of liquid. They don't behave the way oceans behave. They don't have the same movement. She had read extensively about oceans in the xenographic literature available through the Imperial Archives after his first mention of water and cliffs. I've read about them. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, it's different when you're there. She thought about that. She thought about a cliff and moving water and light at a particular angle, the kind of specific, sensory knowledge you couldn't get from documentation, that lived in the body rather than the mind, that required you to actually stand in a place and feel what the wind did to it. She thought about the man who had walked exhausted to the border of a war and stood in front of the thing that had caused it, not destroyed it, not declared victory over it. Looked at it steadily and with both eyes open until it became something that could be negotiated with, that could sign its name on paper and mean it, because the alternative had been made sufficiently clear. She thought about what that cost. The Kalen garrison commander he still thought about. The 11 ships that didn't withdraw from Ferriscale. The nerve agent and the corridor floor at 3 in the morning. The 4 days in a medical bay that wasn't quite right, answering questions about the negotiations. She thought about what it meant to be the man of tomorrow, the phrase his crew had used, the intercept in the intelligence files. Not the future arrived, the future possible, the version that hadn't happened yet and therefore could still go either way. That's what they call you, she said. I am the man of tomorrow. He made the sound that wasn't quite a laugh, the quiet version. They say a lot of things. Is it accurate? He considered it with the full weight of his attention. The dome overhead was completing its cycle toward the deep dark of simulated late night, the stars fully present now, the approximation complete. Tomorrow hasn't happened yet, he said. That's the thing about it, which means it can still go right. He turned the empty flask in his hands, the dent catching the starlight. That's why I'm here, not because I know how it ends. Because I don't, and that means it's still worth working on. Outside the dome, the real stars were doing what they had always done, burning at distances that made small things large and large things small, indifferent to treaties and rogue fleets, and the specific angle of light on cliffs above a moving sea. The galaxy was old and vast, and mostly it didn't carry opinions about what happened inside the small, warm spaces where people tried to build things that lasted. But inside the dome, something had been built. Not a monument, not a declaration. Something quieter than those, harder to name, and for that reason more durable. The kind of thing that started in corridors and gardens and in 47 days of difficult conversation around a table no one found comfortable. The kind that required two people to sit with the discomfort of each other's foreignness and not look away. The kind that was made, not found. She reached across the space between them and took his hand. The one with the two fingers that had healed crooked, at angles that weren't quite right. The permanent record of a night when something came through a wall and met what was waiting on the other side of it. He didn't look at her. He didn't need to. He turned his hand under hers and held on. Outside the dome, the galaxy continued its ancient, indifferent burning. Inside, they stayed until the simulated stars came out. And then they stayed a while after that. In the weeks that followed, the Dominion's legal machinery moved with a slowness that she found alternatively necessary and maddening. The Tribunal for Selvaric and the 8th Fleet Command Staff was convened under the protocols she and Voss had discussed. Dominion law, Dominion process, no involvement from human legal systems. This had been the right call. She understood it more clearly as the proceedings developed. Every outer faction leader who had privately supported Selvaric's action was now formally positioned between their sympathy for the Admiral and their institutional commitment to Dominion legal order. There was no comfortable place to stand. Voss had known there wouldn't be. That was the architecture. She attended the opening session of the tribunal in person, which was unusual for an empress. She attended because she had decided that the war's ending required witnesses, and the most consequential witness she could provide was herself. She sat in the gallery above the proceeding chamber and watched Selvaric stand before the tribunal bench with his 30 years of service record, and his specific, coherent conviction that he had done the right thing, and she felt the complexity of it in a way she was becoming more willing as the months passed to simply hold. He had not been entirely wrong. The war had cost what he said it had cost. The treaty had been made in a room by people who could afford the comfort of abstraction. He had drawn a conclusion from those facts that she would have died rather than endorse, and she believed. She had come to believe, in the 47 days and the garden evenings and the corridors at 3 in the morning, that the conclusion was wrong. But the facts beneath it were not wrong. She said this to Voss that evening. She had not planned to. She had planned to review the first-week documentation from her legal counsel and then rest, because she had not been resting enough and her first advisor Kren had been saying so in increasingly direct terms for 2 weeks. She found herself in the garden instead, which was becoming, without official designation, a place where the decisions were made. He wasn't wrong about the war, she said. Voss was sitting in the usual position, back against the garden wall, facing the dome, the thermos replaced this week with something her kitchen staff had produced that approximated, according to their best current knowledge, a human beverage called tea. He was drinking it with the expression of a man practicing not commenting on the approximation. No, he said, he wasn't wrong about what it cost. But you disagree with what he did. I think he stopped too early. He held the cup in both hands. The simulated evening was in its amber phase, the light warm and oblique. He looked at what the war cost and concluded the war had to continue because the alternative looked like losing. He didn't look at what the alternative could be built into, given time and will, and the willingness to sit in a room with people you find difficult. He glanced at her. I've been in a lot of rooms with people I found difficult. He would say you were the difficult one. He'd be right, he smiled. I usually am in those rooms. That's part of what makes them work. If everyone agrees easily, it means someone is not saying what they actually think. She thought about the 47 days, about Article 11 and the Meridian Second Chair, and the hegemony delegation's retreat on the Drun Passage matter. About the number of times someone had said something in that room that was difficult and true, and the number of times the thing that was difficult and true had moved the conversation to somewhere it couldn't have reached otherwise. "Do you think the treaty holds?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. It was the question she had not asked before, because she had been afraid of the specific quality of his honesty. "I think it has a better chance now than it did before Selvaric moved," he said. "The test came early. It could have come later when the outer factions had more time to build coordination and resources. Coming early meant it came before the opposition was fully consolidated." He turned the cup in his hands, and it came with a result they have to account for. 42 ships went to Ferris Gale. 31 came back under terms. That is now part of what the outer factions know when they consider their options. You designed Ferris Gale to be that result. I prepared it to be a useful result. The Admiral made the decision that produced it. He paused. That's how it works when it works. You don't control the outcome. You shape the environment, you set the conditions, and then the other party makes the choice that the conditions make available to them. She thought about that. She thought about all the choices that had been made in the past 4 months. By her, by him, by Selvaric, by the Meridian Second Chair, by the assassin who had come through a wall and met what was waiting, by the garrison commander at Kalen who had made the logical choices and found the logic was incomplete. The accumulation of choices, each one small or large in its moment, building towards something that couldn't have been predicted at the start. "Do you believe it can last?" she asked. "Not this generation, the next one, the one after." He was quiet for longer this time. The dome was cycling toward deep blue, the first stars appearing. "I believe people get tired," he said, "eventually. Tired of the cost, tired of the fear, tired of the particular flavor of grief that comes from sustained conflict. The question is whether you build something in the tired enough moment that survives the moment when people stop being tired." He looked up at the emerging stars. "That's what the Commission is for, and the accountability protocols, and the joint administration of the disputed systems, not because those structures are beautiful, because they create shared stakes. And shared stakes create the motivation to protect the thing, even when you're not tired anymore, even when someone in the next generation hasn't paid the cost and isn't sure the cost was real." She sat with that for a moment. "You have thought about this for a long time." "Since the second year of the war," he said. "When I understood that the math didn't resolve in favor of either side, when the winning was going to cost more than the winning was worth for everyone involved." He paused. "I was a long time making the argument internally. The Admiralty was resistant. The political leadership was resistant. Humans find peace difficult to argue for in the middle of a war. It sounds like losing." "Does it feel like losing?" He looked at her. The stars were mostly out now, the approximation of them, the built version, her people's best translation of a sky he had grown up under. "No," he said, "it feels like the hardest thing I have ever done, and I have done some difficult things." He held the cup of tea her kitchen staff had made that wasn't quite right. "It feels like tomorrow, which is," he stopped. "Which is what I came for." In the 3rd month after the tribunal's conclusion, the Joint Commission held its first working session. She attended in person, which was again unusual and again deliberate. Voss sat beside her, not behind her, not at a remove, but beside her in the position that had no official designation in her court's protocol manual, because no human peace ambassador had ever occupied it before. Her first advisor Kren had raised this twice, and she had told him to update the manual. The commission was 15 members, 7 from the Dominion's major factions, 7 from the human systems and their allied non-aligned partners, and 1 chair, who was neither. The chair was an elderly being from a small species that had been technologically neutral in the war, not because they were weak, but because they were sufficiently well positioned that neither side had found it advantageous to pressure them. The chair's name took 4 minutes to pronounce correctly, and everyone called her, by arrangement, Miri. The first item on the commission's agenda was the 3 disputed systems. She had been briefed on what the likely arguments would be. She had read the position papers from both sides. She was prepared for the session to be long and difficult. What she was not prepared for was the human delegate from the Ferriscale system, who had lost a ship and a brother-in-law in the war, and who stood up in the commission's 3rd hour and said, "I am prepared to accept the preliminary demarcation proposal if the other side is willing to establish the memorial protocols in the disputed region, not because I am satisfied, because I think satisfaction is the wrong goal. I think making it so this doesn't happen again is the right goal, and this is the path that gets there." The room was very quiet. Miri, the chair, asked if any delegation wished to respond to the proposal. Across the table, the senior Dominion delegate, who had been in the war and who had a daughter who had not come back from it, said, "We accept the preliminary demarcation. We will commit to the memorial protocols." He paused. "I would add that my delegation wishes it noted formally that the delegate from Ferriscale's statement represents the basis on which this commission can do real work. We thank him for it." She reached under the table and found Voss's hand without looking. He was already reaching for hers. In the corridor outside the commission chamber afterward, she said, "You didn't arrange that." "No," he said. He was smiling. "Not the half version or the full version, something different, a quieter thing. I didn't arrange that." "Could you have?" He thought about it seriously, the way he thought about everything. "I could have prepared the conditions that made it possible, built the space for it, but the choice was his." The words were his. He looked at the corridor wall, plain, functional, the architecture of a working station rather than an imperial one. "That's the version that lasts, not because I built it, because he chose it." She thought about choices, about the ones made in corridors at 3 in the morning and in gardens in the simulated evening, and in commission chambers by people who had lost things and were choosing to build rather than mourn, about the ones that accumulated into something no one person had designed, that had the specific texture of being real, because it was made from real decisions by real people with real stakes. "The cliffs," she said. He looked at her. "The ones on your homeworld, where you can see the water from the top." She looked at the corridor wall with him. "I would like to see them, if that's acceptable." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "It's acceptable." She thought the word felt different this time, something like a door that had been opening for a while, and had now opened the rest of the way. Outside the commission chamber, in the corridors and chambers and transit lines of the Imperial Station, the work continued. The machinery of the treaty and the commission and the memorial protocols and the joint administration of 3 disputed star systems, all of it turning with the slow force of something that was trying to become permanent. There would be failures. She knew that. There would be moments when the machinery seized and required repair. There would be outer factions that did not give up their opposition easily, and second-generation politicians who had not paid the cost and were uncertain the cost had been real. But there would also be people in rooms making difficult choices. There would be delegates who stood up and said, "Satisfaction is not the goal." There would be, she hoped, in the 3rd generation and the 4th, some inherited shape in the political architecture that made certain choices easier and certain other choices harder, a residue of the work being done now, invisible by then, load-bearing. She had been taught, as a young empress in training, that peace was a destination, that wars ended and then there was peace, the way a storm ended and then there was calm. She understood now, in the way you understood things you had learned rather than been taught, that this was wrong. Peace was not a destination. It was a practice, daily, imperfect, requiring the same attention and work in the 3rd decade as in the 1st, the same willingness to sit with discomfort and not look away. She understood this because she had watched a man do it for 4 months in a station that wasn't his, and a garden that was built from second-hand descriptions, and a room with a bed that wasn't quite right. She understood it because she had watched him hold the cost of Kalen without setting it down, and hold the cost of Ferriscale without setting it down, and still show up to the commission table and still mean the words. Tomorrow hadn't happened yet, which meant it could still go right. She walked down the corridor beside him and thought about cliffs and water, and the way light came in at an angle in the evening on a homeworld she had not seen, and about the stars above it that were the same stars, the real ones, not the built ones, that she had grown up navigating by. The galaxy was very large and mostly indifferent. But in it today, 2 species had chosen to try. That, she thought, was what the man of tomorrow actually meant. Not that the future was secured, not that the hard part was over, that there were people standing at the border of what had been done and what could be done, looking steadily at the distance between those 2 things and deciding it was worth crossing. She held on to his hand, he held on to hers. Outside, the stars continued their ancient burning. Inside, tomorrow was still possible.